Welcome to Tilt, a podcast from the Santa Fe Art Institute. We are excited to share with you something a little different. We've turned this episode over to writer and editor Dr. Alicia Inez Guzmán and SFAI Story Maps fellows Diego Medina and Christian Gering, in order to help make sense of recent events across the country, and especially here in Santa Fe, around monuments and memory, the stories we celebrate and the stories that have been erased. This is episode 5, part 1, titled Axis Mundi.
You are listening to Unsettled.
Got this pine cone in my brain, got my eyes open, I'm saying it's that wake up, that breaking free for them chains. It's that welcome to a new age, this right here for like a new wave.
By the time Indigenous Peoples Day arrived, over 100 Confederate monuments had been taken down, whether by force of law or by force of the people. Over 30 monuments to Christopher Columbus came down in the same time period. Look at Baltimore, where a statue of Columbus tumbled into the waters of the city's inner harbor after being pulled off of its pedestal by protesters. The internet exploded with memes about how Columbus had discovered the harbor. My Instagram stories overflowed with suggestions for possible Italian-American replacements. Lady Gaga, Joey Tribbiani, Marissa Tomei's character in My Cousin Vinny, or, in one meme, the widely beloved hoagie sandwich. The next day, Baltimore's fallen Columbus had to be foisted out of the green, murky water, like a capsized ship. There were monuments to lesser-known figures that came down too: Juniper Serra, J.E.B. Stuart, and John C. Calhoun. In literary theory, they would be called actants, those people, men I should say, and they are almost always men, playing active roles in colonialism and imperialism's greater master narratives. If I could draw a Venn diagram between all of them, their ideologies would be linked to the moment when colonial contact created global empires and hierarchies of difference. Each, in his own way, believed the Americas were open to settlement at whatever cost. Terra nullius. Here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the arrival of summer brought governor's orders and lockdown, a particularly specious presidential election, the rise of white militias, and a deep social unrest, even public mourning in the face of what seemed like unending police brutality and rising COVID fatalities. Navajo communities were suffering some of the highest rates of infection and death in the nation, higher even than New York. We didn't have Columbus's or Calhoun's loading over our public spaces, but we did have statues of Juan Neoñate, Diego DeVargas, and tributes to Kit Carson, figures who came from different time periods, but whose legacies of brutality were bearing onto our present moment like an old wound that had never quite healed. The past is alive, a living thing, a character from the novel Lovecraft Country told his son Atticus. You own it. Owe it. Atticus, as the story unfolds, finds out that it is not only familial bonds that connect him to his forebears, but also unspeakable violence. And so, our city, like most of America, was confronting how our collective histories of violence were bubbling up into the crises of our today. Who and what was being memorialized in public space? These were questions that gained resonance in the months following the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers. I watched as our communities attempted to reckon with colonization, racism, and white supremacy, as well as with the symbols and revisionist histories they had spawned. I bore witness to voices who spoke of anti-indigeneity, anti-blackness, and the need for solidarity between communities of color. But I also observed in Santa Fe and across New Mexico a rupture within ourselves, our communities, and our own identities. There was a chasm as big as the Rio Grande Gorge. Who were we, after all? At least monuments were objects, solid and fixed. They were tangible. They could be cast onto the concrete, yanked into the ocean, and leveled. But the problem was our identities aren't so definite, especially here where colonial contact made miscegenation a rule and not an exception. Whether original inhabitants, settlers, or of deeply mixed descent, the identities that make up this place are far more fluid than public monuments could ever mirror. I was wondering in myself what histories had been forgotten or erased. What identities remain latent and others manifest? Who was I, and who is my community? This first episode of Unsettled looks at our city's collective reckoning with one monument, the Soldiers' Monument, and the moments leading up to its downfall. What I found was that our current political moment of divisive rhetoric and othering had more of an impact on how our community felt about the monument and its departure than its actual history. Whether it represented any community here was debatable, and that unto itself said a lot. City workers had been handed a shit sandwich. They were given the awkward task of detaching statues like Diego de Vargas from their bases and carting them off to secret storages. They were functionaries, a word Hilton Alls likes to use to denote those who carry out orders in a system where bigger decision makers didn't include them, but needed them to do the work. In Santa Fe, the DeVargas statue dedicated in 2007 was taken out of Cathedral Park, leaving nothing but an empty square where its pedestal once stood. There was outrage in the Spanish community because, as the most vocal pointed out, he disappeared without their input. While he went into storage for safekeeping, some of Santa Fe's residents offered a vigil in the statue's honor. There were candles with pictures of the Virgin Mary, all surrounded by red, white, and blue party favors and American flags. It was as if De Vargas, who had died a Spaniard in 1704 in Bernalillo, had suffered a second death as a Spanish American living in Santa Fe in 2020. The memorial represented a strange schism in the community and the ways that some members had configured their identity as a mixture of the American patriotism of the present and the Spanish colonialism of the past. It also expressed that those same community members had felt a sense of loss in his absence. De Vargas, Santa Fe's paterfamilias and leader of the Spanish conquest of the city after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, had become yet another casualty of a city getting further and further away from its Spanish roots. Days before, a statue of Juan de Oñate was taken down from the Rio Grande National Heritage Center. From the videos, it looked like a couple of guys in hard hats doing a job they might have done any other day. It was almost mundane if not for the thing they were attempting to haul away. The local newspaper described it this way. County road and building maintenance staff around midday had taken a torch to the bronze hooves of the horse Oñate road, loosened the metal from the concrete base, and lifted the statue into the air with a bulldozer. Then they drove away with it down the highway, preparing it to store in what County Manager Tomas Campos described as a top-secret location. After it departed, a bigger crowd arrived, and a group of indigenous women who'd gathered at its base turned their backs on the crowd and burned sage. They held what the rest of us could have only assumed was a form of ceremony as cars zoomed by along Highway 285. Then others played drums, sang, and danced atop the empty pedestal. If there was ever a definition of taking up space, and taking up space in the kind of way that Black, Indigenous, and people of color use the phrase, here it was in front of my eyes. Many people spoke that afternoon, including Luis Peña, a Chicano who'd helped spearhead the efforts to take the monument down. Representatives from the Red Nation hopped onto the mic, too, and recalled histories of colonial violence. One indigenous woman speaking of growing up in Española, a border town not unlike Gallup and Albuquerque. All three towns border tribes, and all three towns have higher rates of violence against indigenous peoples, especially women. She said, "Fuck settlers," to which someone across the street responded by yelling, "Que viva Oñate," in the same way you might hear someone say, "Que viva Mexico." For good measure, she added, "Fuck these chuds," pointing to the officers who had surrounded everybody. A friend of mine pointed out after the fact that a few of those cops had kids from some of the various pueblos. Some of the cops might have even been from tribes themselves. It was hard to tell where one identity ended and another began. Every monument was deeply polarizing, so much so that in Albuquerque, a man protesting another statue of DJO, or Don Juan Oñate, was shot by a member of the New Mexico Civil Guard, a local militia that said their goal was to protect the bronze statue. The shooter was a Hispanic man named Stephen Baca. In those moments, it was clear that monuments were more than symbols of oppression. They seemed to wield enough power to create the kind of rabia or madness that could induce harm. Oñate had died long ago, exiled from New Mexico for his crimes against Native peoples, and yet here his likeness was creating a new chapter of violence. In Santa Fe, Mayor Alan Weber made a public announcement on the bandstand of the plaza, committing to taking down 3 monuments in this city, one of which was the Soldiers Monument, the 33-foot-tall obelisk located right in the middle of the plaza. He was attempting to avoid the kind of violence that had taken place just days before. As a Jewish man, he quoted a passage from the Old Testament. There were other speakers too, like Three Sisters Collective, the indigenous women's group dedicated to rematriating space, and the same group who had held the meeting where the mayor made the agreement to take the obelisk down. Black women and men spoke of the Black Lives Matter movement and solidarity among indigenous and African American communities. There was more singing and burning of sage and mentions of our southern relatives, migrants, attempting to cross a border that had, until the 20th century, been fluid. It was a somber celebration, and the decision, it seemed, was all but sealed. That was June.
The actual toppling of the obelisk is often portrayed as a riot or a sort of mad event. It was actually a very beautiful event. I would not even call it a riot. I would call it actually one of the most intentional, intensely spiritual experiences I have seen. After the obelisk came down, there was a lot of praying, there was a lot of singing. I noticed that doesn't get mentioned in these accounts. I mean, as though they were these mad, riotous people. They were mad, I'm sure, in the sense of angry, but they knew exactly what they were doing, and it had a purposefulness.
That's Darryl Wellington describing the moments after the obelisk came down. It was October 12th, Indigenous Peoples Day, and this time it wasn't city workers or even county workers who did the job, but a mixed bag of people, some of whom had been occupying the area around the obelisk for 2 days and who'd been cleared out the night before by police but returned later. They were mostly, Darryl calls, white people.
So that would be the key difference in my impression and what has been portrayed. And by the way, that also was my complete impression of the crowd. People were very moved, including all the people who didn't participate at all, and in some cases, people who didn't even know what was going on, were very moved and inspired because they felt not that they were not watching a riot. They felt that they were watching something very special. But on the first day of the 3-day protest, I didn't make it the first day. I made it the second day. And I would just, to go and check out what was going on, and I'll see people and, talk. That's what I do. And it was a very peaceful protest, what they had going on. And my main memory of the story is they had a little collection plate. And I talked to some people, and I reached in my pocket to put something in, and immediately Native American women go, "Oh, no, not you. No." And she takes the plate and she goes, "In fact, if you want to take some money and get a soda, you're welcome too." And I knew exactly what she meant. She meant you're African American. One of their signs that they had was Black Lives, Indigenous People Unity. That was one of the signs that they had. I mean, she's expressing solidarity with African Americans and with the Black Lives Matter movement, which did not start the movement to end the obelisk, but certainly has jump-started all kinds of progressive movement in the last few months all across the country. And later it even became clear, and the reason partially why that story sticks in my mind, because later it even became clearer what she meant. So then, of course, as I'm sure you know, later that night, I was not there when the police were called on that group, but I was shocked that the police were called because it was more like a picnic than even a protest. It very much felt that the police were called for one reason, because most of the signs there were asking, Mayor Weber, when are you going to act? Mayor Weber, are you going to be a leader who breaks treaties with Native Americans? And it very much felt to me like it was shut down freedom of speech. Okay? So I show up the next day, and there are police and all of this. And this part is the most fascinating to me. And I felt that it was going to get volatile, though I don't know how. But and I've tried to explain this to several people, and they often do not want to listen. Because, okay, let's deal with the question of, well, how did the crowd get stirred up? And there are videos, but this is all from my memory. Very early on, when the Teo woman began speaking, they asked all the Native Americans and all the Black Americans who wanted to come to the main stage, the stage. And of course, this is Santa Fe. Get real. Most of the people in the crowd are Anglo, possibly some Latinos, Hispanic, I don't know. But very many, I'm pretty sure, are Anglo. And I never went up on the stage just because I wanted to have a good seat in my way to just observe what happened. And she asked them all, and there were a lot of speeches saying what you would expect, saying the same things that those signs that they made them take down the day before were saying, that the mayor had not kept his word and thing, and going on about how this obelisk was a symbol of oppression. And there was one speaker in particular who, frankly, I think did a masterful job, just a masterful job. And she really started digging into the crowd. I mean, she started saying that she just would repeat over and over, what are you going to do, white allies? And I wrote an article that said, what are you going to do, America, about this whole thing? And I actually never got that quote in there, but the reason I called it that was because that was her refrain. What are you going to do, white allies? And she would think that, are you going to go to the plaza and buy more fake jewelry? Are you going to go steal more Native American land? What are you going to do? When she would never tell you what to do. She would just keep repeating and repeating and repeating. What are you going to stand for? What are you going to believe in? While the obelisk is surrounded by, just really, really digging. I cannot remember all the words, but some of them were very personal. And you could see people being moved. And gradually, people began approaching the police and having encounters. In other words, are you just going to stand there, or are you going to do something? And they would be more encounters, and then it would just go up. And she would not stop. There was more than one speaker, by the way, but she just sticks out in my mind because of this refrain. And some of them were just so perfect what she was saying. Then there were encounters that actually at one point looked like they could become, violent. And then the police just left. After they arrested some people, the irony being whoever they arrested couldn't have had anything to do with the toppling of the obelisk because that hadn't even started yet. But then they just left. But even after they left, she did not relent. She just went on. And at one point she said, wow, if you'd been Black, you'd all been shot by now.
With a few tow ropes and a chain, Darryl wrote later in an article, the monument was pulled down piece by piece until finally it was a heaping pile of rubble. At 152 years old, the obelisk had been the most contentious of all the monuments because one of its 4 marble tablets read, "To the heroes who have fallen in battles with savage Indians in the territory of New Mexico." Right in the middle of the Santa Fe Plaza, it was the city's axis mundi, literally the center of the Santa Fe land grant, which had been confirmed in 1890 by the U.S. Court of Private Land Claims. Economically, the plaza was a tourist hub where folks from out of town seek their turquoise or their Lucchese boots or attend one of many summer markets. It's also where lowriders cruise on Sunday afternoon and where a yearly lowrider show is held, where itinerant poets hang out, and crust punks, and native people selling jewelry under the portal of the Palace of the Governors. It's where the Santa Fe fiestas are held, and where the Entrada, a pageant dramatizing DeVargas' Reconquest, was held. In the 1970s, an indigenous man donning a construction vest chiseled out the word savage in broad daylight. Others have since written in replacement adjectives, courageous being one. The first comments Arts Commissioner Alma Castro read on social media in the days afterward all had the same tenor. The people who took it down weren't even from here.
And so it was just really interesting to see a lot of the comments of folks being like, oh, she's not even from here, but she lives here. And I'm like, that's a little bit of the history of Santa Fe. That is a little bit of history of conquest. Like, we're not from here. Mm-hmm. None of us are from here. And we're making claims to identities to monuments to historical events that I just find really interesting, especially now at this pivotal moment. I mean, we're dealing with divisiveness in terms of politics.
Those comments mostly came from the self-identified Spanish community. Yet again, they said outsiders were meddling in Santa Fe's affairs and taking something else away from local people. And being or not being from here was a question, or rather a declaration as old as the city. To some extent, it was at the heart of the obelisk and at the heart of whose belief could lay claim to public space. But as the owner of Castro's Cafe, a restaurant her parents started 30 years ago that now sits between Pete's, a homeless shelter, and Cheeks, the city's only strip club, Alma witnessed just how hard it was to disentangle the obelisk from hyperlocal understandings of Spanish identity, as well as national politics and the election, loyalties towards the police, and simultaneously calls for defunding them, and, of course, tourism. Her own restaurant, opened by her mom, who's from here but grew up in the Bay Area during the Chicano movement, and her dad, who arrived in Santa Fe in the 80s from El Salvador, was a good example of how hard it was to bifurcate a sense of self into anything categorical. The obelisk was the same.
It's very complicated, and I love that, like, we are in a place where we can, like, dive into some of those complexities. I think it's so funny how, like, DNA plays a part now in our identity politics and how we're discussing, like, who we are, right? My mom's from here, so I guess a little bit of my background, like, I'm born and raised in Santa Fe. Same as everybody else, like, we're Gonzaleses and Ortizes and 500 generations, and we can trace ourselves back to, and we're Spanish of 100 until you actually go into records and you realize that my great-grandmother was probably Pueblo and probably passing, and was adopted by her aunt and uncle who were passing as Hispanic. And our identities are very complex and mixed. And then we go do our DNA, and I was super excited to find out that I was 17% British. I was like, now the British baking soda obsession totally makes sense.
Same.
Yes, like, I get to have a siesta and tea and crumpets if I want, and that's okay. Not to mention, our indigenous backgrounds, and not, like, the one thing that I've been struggling with, I think, recently is my place in the Black Lives Matter movement, as a business owner, as a commissioner, as a former organizer. I don't have a huge connection to the African American community, except that I just lived in Chicago, and I, like, got to see a lot of police violence against people and understand, like, where frustrations are being, not even held, like, fostered. I have a Black Lives Matter box here at the restaurant, and I have gotten so much backlash. I have definitely police officers that are not coming back in because they are not okay with me having just a statement saying that Black Lives Matter.
Whoa.
We had I had the dumb Trump sign on the marquee for a long time. We were getting calls all the time. People from out of state, right, saying that, oh, every time we go to Santa Fe, we go in, and we're not going in this time because of your marquee. And I'm like, that's awesome. I understand that you feel hurt. Like, please feel hurt. But this is our stance. And ultimately, we're here for locals. And there's a lot of locals that don't agree with my standpoint, and we'll talk about it, but they'll still come in.
Born in Savannah, Georgia, Darryl lived in Charleston, South Carolina for many years before moving to Santa Fe just around a decade ago. As a Black Southerner, Darryl remembers that the same day Mayor Weber announced that the obelisk would come down in Santa Fe, the mayor of Charleston announced the statue of John C. Calhoun would come down too. The former vice president of the United States under Andrew Jackson, Calhoun famously called the institution of slavery a positive good on the floor of the Senate. Not only were slaves treated well, he rationalized, but everyone at one point in the history of civilization owned slaves.
I wrote an article in which I discussed this on the very day. First of all, I'm from the South. Obviously, there are Confederate memorials all over the place. Since the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, not since George Floyd, but even before that, from 2014, those monuments have been very heavily questioned. And even before that, I really oversimplified that. all through my youth, the Confederate flag was a huge issue. The Confederate flag, which was only finally removed in, I believe, 2006, primarily because Dylan Roof 7 people in a church in South Charleston, South Carolina. I'm talking about the South Carolina Confederate flag. And that's where I lived for the longest time. And so, look, as far as I'm concerned, all those emblems are emblems of humiliation. All those emblems are about putting African Americans down. And you have to take it in the context of the whole culture of a city like Charleston, which is so biased toward Confederate history, which is so biased toward accounts of slavery, which diminish its importance. And then you add that insult to a Confederate flag, which is right there in your face. And which was even only not removed, not because of some vast reconsideration of history, but because it was the thing to do at the moment after the Charleston massacre. And so I have a long history with those emblems, and I was much a supporter of removing them, and many have come down. And in Charleston, there's a monument to a man named John C. Calhoun, or which is was literally on a 100-foot pedestal. I mean, it's huge. It's right. It's really, to make the analogy deeper, almost the equivalent of the plaza. It's in the main park in Charleston, South Carolina, downtown, right when you go to the shops. And it's been there, God, since the late 1800s. And finally, with all the pressure after George Floyd's death and with all the marches, the mayor of Charleston announced it was coming down on the very same day that Mayor Weber here announced that he was removing several monuments in Santa Fe. And so the analogy was brought very home to me because I could sit on Facebook and I could look at reactions to both. I mean, in the South, it's been a long struggle. I'm here too, but as I admitted before, I'm more in touch with the struggle in the South. There's been a long struggle to get people to appreciate these things. It's been a long struggle to get them to unrevive their revisionist history.
In the South, Darryl said, it's been a long struggle to get people to unrevise their revisionist history. Still, within 2 weeks of the announcement in South Carolina to take down John C. Calhoun did, in fact, come down.
Growing up in the South, and I've talked to many friends about this, there's a kind of psychological damage that's inflicted on you early on, at least in my generation, because most of the accounts of slavery that you would hear when I was coming up implied very distinctly that, well, it wasn't that bad. And yet it never quite makes sense to you because other information gets to you and it doesn't jive with what these people appear to be telling you for their own convenience. And so it's like this constant barrage of propaganda. So right here, and even before I participated in the protest against the fiesta, and I met more and more people who would talk about their experiences. And so I was both joyed that the obelisk and the other monuments were coming down, and joyed that John C. Calhoun was coming down. And what the Native Americans had to say, and the disenfranchised Black Southerner, and particularly in Charleston, who've been just gentrified out of there like crazy. Look it up. I think it's the most gentrified city in the US. Yes, more so than Santa Fe. It has lost in the last 10 years about 40% of its Black population. Just insane. And looking at their reactions, they were very similar. I've gone through so much grief and emotional turmoil and so much frustration. I just can't believe it's happening. Now, then we get to the distinction. The John C. Calhoun statue came down within 2 weeks. The obelisk never came down except a few weeks ago. We know how, but yeah, the John C. Calhoun statue, he did remove it. Yes, the mayor, like has happened in several southern cities, even before George Floyd in New Orleans, they removed several Confederate monuments just because the Confederacy has had its day. I mean, it has a fewer and fewer defenders, and it has a national spotlight on it. You know, very much so. That always helps. It has a national spotlight on it, and so, but that's the main distinction.
In Santa Fe, the mayor's decision to take down the obelisk was followed by crickets. Nothing happened. There were no more public announcements. The base of the obelisk was boarded up and covered in a couple of poems commissioned by the city's youth. There were murmurings of an attempt to take it down by a contractor in the middle of the night, but the job went unfinished. The tip of the obelisk was gone, but some 30 feet of sandstone and marble remained. Then another period of silence followed. The kind of silence where you know everyone was thinking about the obelisk, but no one, at least in a public way, was talking about it. It was the elephant in the plaza.
Obviously, with the obelisk, whatever reason, as we know, it didn't come down. You know, which, as I pointed out, was it's really rather cruel. That's my honest opinion. I would call it cruel to say that and then to not do that. It's like a woman and you have her rapist, and you say, "Oh, there's your rapist, and we're gonna prosecute her." And then you're like, "Well, when you gonna prosecute him? When you gonna prosecute him?" Oh, I'm not. Oh, I said that. That's just what it's like. So
There were questions over jurisdiction. Was it city property or federal? City attorneys were maybe debating those issues, but it was hard to know. And more than that, there was still wide support in the Spanish community for keeping the obelisk right where it was. It wasn't a monument to DeVargas or Ben Oñate or to any conquistador for that matter, but rather a monument raised in the 19th century as tribute to both the soldiers who died in the battles of Valverde and Glorieta Pass and the Indian Wars. As settlers increasingly moved into indigenous territories, and in this region, especially after the Pikes Peak gold rush of 1859, white settlement continued to increase. The Homestead Act of 1862 pushed people further westward into ancestral indigenous lands that, to the U.S. government, were considered public domain, increasing armed conflicts between settlers, indigenous peoples, and the U.S. Army. At face value, the monument felt confused. On the one hand, it paid tribute to Union soldiers, and on the other, it lauded those soldiers who died battling native peoples on the frontier in an attempt to make space for more white people. The Soldiers' Monument, according to Dr. Esteban Rayel Galvez, friend, colega, and scholar of Native American slavery, was conceived in 1865, 3 years before it was built. Ohio-born John P. Slough, appointed in 1865 by President Andrew Johnson as the Chief Justice of the New Mexico Territorial Supreme Court, spearheaded the effort to build the memorial. He wrote recently in an essay titled "Centering Truths Not So Evident." It was, Esteban continues, originally intended to focus solely on Union victories in New Mexico. New Mexico, I should note, had only been a territory of the U.S. for some 14 years when volunteers from various regiments were called upon to fight in the Trans-Mississippi Theater of the Civil War. The U.S. had annexed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Mexico's holdings in the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo in 1848, resulting in a massive transfer of wealth and land away from communities living in this region. Although those communities were given a choice to stay or repatriate to Mexico, most chose to stay. The border crossed us, as people here like to say. We didn't cross the border. The men and women who stayed would very likely have regarded themselves not as Spanish, but as Mexicanos y Mexicanas, as my great-grandmother Juanita Montoya, who lived all 103 years of her life in Truchas, had. She always said, "Yo soy Mexicana." The monument, which had been underwritten by an appropriation from the territorial legislature, took longer than expected and required another $1,800. By the time the funding was available in 1868, the legislature required that the memorial also commemorate officers and enlisted men killed and died of wounds received in the different battles and skirmishes with Indians in the territory of New Mexico. Among the lists of Union soldiers who died were surnames like Cummins, Watson, Johnson, Dickey, and O'Connell, all written in old-timey cursive and all in English, but there were Spanish surnames too, like Quintana, Chavez in Baca. I decided to meet Virgil J. Vigil, a retired colonel, pilot, and president of La Union Protectiva, a fraternity founded in 1915, just 3 years after New Mexico attained statehood. La Union celebrates Spanish heritage and pays for some of the burial costs of its membership, a tradition they've kept since their founding year as a mutualista, or mutual aid society. La Union's building, which is on Galisteo Street, had a table at the front with seating for the president and vice president, and then rows of chairs for members. There were faded black and white pictures on the wall of old presidents, and below a sign with 3 large circles, each a different color, and each representing a tenet of the organization: Unión, Instrucción, Protección. Above, 2 hands clasped together in a handshake, the organization's seal. It was this organization that wanted to recall the mayor after the DeVargas statue was removed from Cathedral Park and after the obelisk came down because, as Virgil emphatically pointed to the word protección behind him, La Unión was founded to protect.
The other reason it was formed is because these 3 tenants that we have here, Unión, that's the organization, instructions, history, culture, and the other one is protection. Okay, so we do our meetings in Spanish. Back then, yes, all our initiations are in Spanish. Everything's in Spanish because we're trying to protect our culture and our history. If you don't continue it, it will die. So we are continuing it, and that's what we're doing. So protection, we're here to protect our history and our culture is what we're here to do also.
Virgil's great-great-great-grandfather was the first Hispanic territorial governor of New Mexico, Donaciano Vigil, a man born Spanish in 1801, witnessed Mexican independence in 1821, and died American in 1877. Donaciano was alive when a coalition of Pueblo and Hispanic men called El Cantón staged a coup against their Mexican governor for instituting taxes that were too high in 1837. He was also alive when American forces captured Santa Fe in 1846, and he was alive when the obelisk was erected in 1868. Virgil says that the mayor didn't understand Spanish culture and history because he thought he was better. He came from Portland, and before that, somewhere else back east. And look at Portland. That place is a mess. It reminded me of my great-grandmother, who used to say that anyone who wasn't from here came from the Quinto Infierno, regardless of where they were actually from. But for Virgil, the mayor's lack of understanding of Spanish culture was really the reason why protesters were able to take down the obelisk without intervention or consultation. Not even the clergy was consulted about the future of this particular monument. And wasn't the church part of Santa Fe too? Most people, he said, don't even know their history, for the inscription pays tribute to all those soldiers, including New Mexicans from Fort Union, who died keeping Confederate Texans from capturing gold in Colorado.
Everything that we enjoy today came from the old world, came from Spain, because they brought it with them in those ships. And of course, then they populated and it grew. So this land didn't have any. Yes, the natives were here, yes, but they didn't have those, what do I call them? The agriculture products, and also the animals, those that they brought from Spain.
Virgil rolls hard for the Spanish culture he has worked to protect at La Unión. While he admits that he has some native ancestry, I can't help but feel like his explanation of the arrival of Spanish foodstuffs and agriculture is a defense mechanism. The kind of explanation born from a sense of longing and a need to rationalize what he sees as the benefits of colonization. Everyone dies in wars, he, a retired colonel, repeats often, on all sides.
Todos hispanos. He saw that all these, the homes, the people that he knew, his amigos, his primos, everybody, they're all gone, and there's all different type of people from, You see different license plates from all over the country, all over the country. And he was seeing that.
And that made him feel...
Well, that made him feel sorry that it was happening.
Yeah.
That it wasn't staying in the families. He doesn't have the connection with them, okay, with those type of people. They move in, but, they're not as friendly as they used to be. It's not a tight-knit community anymore,
Right. Do you remember when it was a tight-knit community?
Oh, yeah, I do. We're all primos, everybody. My primos and I, we all grew up together. We all used to play together, and we used to go down to the store. There used to be a little store down there, Orlando's little store. It's still there, but it's closed because of the COVID. But it's still there. So yes, we were a tight community. We all used to go to the same schools. There's a Cristo Rey Church was built, and then they built the school there, Cristo Rey. So we all went to the school there, and at the time it was a Catholic school, okay, and it was taught by the Sisters of St. Joseph that were from Boston. So even when I was growing up and I went to school, I was retained in the first grade because we all learned Spanish at home.
Right.
And when I went to the first grade, I didn't know very much of English, so I fell behind. See, which is okay. In fact, even today, I don't like the idea of progressing a child that is deficient, not ready to go next grade, because they fall further behind and further behind. They never catch up, and what happens eventually, they quit. So I'd rather have them stay behind until they're able to catch up.
Virgil's talking about his dad, who watched his new residents with license plates from everywhere else start buying up old family homes and reshaping his barrio into a place that was neither welcoming nor affordable. He never says the word gentrification, but he doesn't need to. It's implied. So as a person who reps his Spanish-European identity, Virgil has been no less beholden to the forces of Americanization. Still, he poses that it was a good thing those Bostonian nuns held him back in the first grade for not speaking proper English. When he tells this story, I can't help but think of my mom, who was prohibited from speaking Spanish at public school, probably around the same time as Virgil. That shame, many decades old, persists even now. So when Virgil calls those who took down the obelisk people who aren't from here, it's a statement with a lot of baggage, more than 150 years worth, entangled and contradictory, and yes, internalized.
Got this pine cone in my brain, got my eyes open, I'm saying it's that wake up, that breaking free from them chains. It's that welcome to a new age, this right here feel like a new wave. Third eye open wide, no fluoride, I decalcify, open up them lotus petals, higher free, no lower levels, find the holy.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Till Unsettled. This episode was produced by Alicia with interviews by Diego and post-production by Christian. Our theme song is rapper Wake Self's Holy Water. It can be found on his posthumous album, Ready to Live. Unsettled is a 9-part series. Keep listening on our website at sfai.org or the SFAI channel at podbean.com. This project is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts.
Third eye opened up, third eye opened up. Keep it alkaline, keep it alkaline.